The topic of this video is Abraham Lincoln's journey from that humble origin to the highest seat of power in a country tearing itself apart. Welcome to History Unlocked. Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss our explorations into the lives that changed everything. February 12, 1809. In the frozen wilderness of Hardin County, Kentucky, a child entered the world in circumstances that promised nothing. The one-room log cabin where Abraham Lincoln drew his first breath measured barely 14 feet on each side. No windows, a dirt floor, gaps between the logs wide enough to see daylight. This was not the birthplace of presidents. This was the edge of survival. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was a carpenter and farmer who moved his family constantly, always searching for better land, better opportunities, better luck. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother, could neither read nor write, but she possessed something rarer than education, an unshakable belief that her children deserved more than the poverty into which they were born. Young Abraham had one older sister, Sarah, and together they grew up in a world where books were luxuries and formal schooling was nearly impossible. The Kentucky frontier demanded everything from its inhabitants. By the time Abraham could walk, he was expected to work, fetching water, gathering firewood, helping his father clear land. The labor was endless, the rewards minimal. Yet even as a small child, Abraham showed an unusual hunger, not for food, though the family often went without, but for knowledge. Whenever a traveler passed through with a book, young Abe would beg to borrow it. He read by firelight, he read while walking to do chores, he read until the words were memorized. But the frontier was not just harsh, it was deadly. In 1818, when Abraham was 9 years old, a mysterious illness swept through their community. Milk sickness, they called it, caused by cows grazing on white snakeroot plants. The poison passed through the milk and into anyone who drank it. Nancy Lincoln fell ill. For a week, she suffered, growing weaker each day while her family watched helplessly. Then she was gone. Abraham Lincoln would later say he could not remember his mother's face clearly, but he never forgot the lesson of her death. Life could be taken without warning, without fairness, without mercy. The boy who buried his mother in the Indiana wilderness learned that the world owed him nothing. Everything would have to be earned. Thomas Lincoln remarried a year later. Sarah Bush Johnston arrived with 3 children of her own, transforming the Lincoln household overnight. Where Nancy had been quiet and frail, Sarah was strong and decisive. She brought furniture, dishes, and most importantly for young Abraham, books. She saw potential in the gangly, awkward boy who preferred reading to hunting. She protected his study time. She encouraged his questions. She became the mother who would shape the mind of a future president. Abraham's formal education totaled less than 1 year, spread across several frontier schools. The schoolmasters were often barely educated themselves, teaching basic arithmetic and reading in one-room cabins to students of all ages. Abraham attended when farm work permitted, which was rarely, yet what he lacked in formal instruction, he compensated for with relentless self-education. He borrowed every book he could find, the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and later, books on law and politics. By his teenage years, Abraham had grown to an astonishing height, eventually reaching 6 feet 4 inches, a giant in an era when the average man stood several inches shorter. He was rail-thin but surprisingly strong, capable of incredible physical feats. Stories spread of young Lincoln splitting hundreds of fence rails in a single day, of wrestling matches where he defeated much stockier opponents through leverage and determination rather than brute strength. In 1830, when Abraham was 21, the Lincoln family made their final move, this time to Illinois. For Abraham, it marked the beginning of independence. He worked odd jobs, rail splitting, flatboat pilot, store clerk. Each position taught him something new about human nature, about commerce, about the vast and varied nation he inhabited. It was during a flatboat journey down the Mississippi River to New Orleans that Abraham Lincoln first witnessed slavery in its full, brutal reality. He had seen enslaved people before, but New Orleans hosted one of the largest slave markets in America. Here, human beings were bought and sold like livestock. Families were separated. Children were torn from mothers. The cruelty was systematic, legal, and endorsed by half the nation. The experience shook Lincoln to his core. Years later, a companion from that journey recalled Lincoln saying, "If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." The seed of his future conviction was planted in the soil of witnessed injustice. By 1831, Lincoln had settled in New Salem, Illinois, a small village where he would spend the next 6 transformative years. He worked at a general store, where his honesty became legendary. when he accidentally shortchanged a customer. He walked miles to return the few cents owed, earning the nickname Honest Abe that would follow him throughout his life. But New Salem offered Lincoln something more valuable than employment: community. He joined a debating society, where his natural gift for clear, logical argument began to emerge. He borrowed books on law, grammar, and surveying. He taught himself geometry. He absorbed knowledge with an intensity that struck everyone who knew him. It was also in New Salem that Abraham Lincoln experienced his first profound romantic love, and Rutledge was the daughter of a local tavern keeper. Beautiful and educated by frontier standards, Lincoln and Anne became close, and most historians believe they intended to marry. But in August 1835, Anne contracted typhoid fever. Within weeks, she was dead at 22. Lincoln's grief was overwhelming. Friends worried he might harm himself. For weeks, he could barely function, lost in a depression so deep that his personality seemed fundamentally altered. The loss of Anne Rutledge taught Lincoln another cruel lesson: love itself was no protection against fate's arbitrary strikes. Yet from this darkness emerged determination. Lincoln threw himself into studying law with renewed intensity. He had no money for law school and no formal training, but he borrowed law books and memorized legal principles. In 1836, at age 27, Abraham Lincoln obtained his law license and began practicing in Springfield, Illinois, the state capital. Springfield in the 1830s and 40s was a frontier town transforming into a political center. Lincoln joined the legal circuit, traveling from county to county on horseback, representing clients in cases ranging from property disputes to criminal trials. He was not the most polished attorney, but he was among the most effective. His ability to distill complex legal issues into simple, understandable terms won over juries. His reputation for integrity meant judges and clients trusted him. Lincoln's law practice also drew him deeper into politics. He had been elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834 as a member of the Whig Party. Serving 4 consecutive terms, he advocated for internal improvements, education, and infrastructure development. But more than any specific policy, Lincoln became known for his oratory. His speeches were logical, sometimes humorous, always memorable. In 1842, Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd, a woman from a wealthy, prominent Kentucky family. Their courtship had been rocky, breaking off once before they finally wed. Mary was intelligent, educated, and ambitious. She believed Abraham would achieve greatness, and she pushed him toward it. Their marriage was complicated, marked by genuine affection but also by Mary's volatile temperament and the immense pressures that would come with political life. Together, they had 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. But the Lincoln family would be haunted by tragedy. Edward died at age 3 in 1850. William would die at 11 in 1862. While Lincoln was president, only Robert would survive to adulthood. The deaths of his children deepened Lincoln's natural melancholy, that darkness that friends had observed since Anne Rutledge's death, a sadness that never fully lifted. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, his only term in Congress. It was not a successful period politically. He opposed the Mexican-American War, a stance that was deeply unpopular in Illinois. When his term ended in 1849, Lincoln returned to Springfield, seemingly finished with politics, focusing on building his law practice. But the 1850s brought a crisis that would pull Lincoln back into the political arena. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, championed by Senator Stephen Douglas, allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. This popular sovereignty approach effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had limited slavery's expansion. For Lincoln, who had long opposed slavery's spread, this was intolerable. He re-entered politics with a clarity of purpose he had never possessed before. In 1858, the Republican Party nominated Lincoln to run against Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senate. What followed were the Lincoln-Douglas debates, 7 face-to-face encounters across Illinois that became the most famous political debates in American history. Douglas was polished, experienced, well-funded. Lincoln was awkward, less wealthy, less connected. But Lincoln had something Douglas lacked: moral clarity. Douglas argued that each territory should decide the slavery question for itself, that the federal government had no right to interfere. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong, that a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal could not indefinitely maintain human bondage. In the debate at Freeport, Lincoln posed a question that would haunt Douglas: Could settlers in a territory vote to exclude slavery before achieving statehood? Despite the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, Douglas answered yes, protecting his immediate political interests but alienating Southern Democrats. Lincoln knew what he was doing. He was willing to lose the Senate race to position himself for something larger, and lose he did. The Illinois legislature chose Douglas, but Lincoln's performance in the debates had made him a national figure. His speeches were reprinted in newspapers across the country. People who had never heard of Abraham Lincoln now knew his name. In 1860, the Republican Party, meeting in Chicago, needed a presidential candidate. William Seward was the favorite, but he had made too many enemies. Lincoln emerged as the compromise candidate, acceptable to different Republican factions. On the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln won the nomination. The 1860 presidential election was unlike any before it, for major candidates ran, splitting the vote along sectional and ideological lines. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. In fact, his name didn't even appear on the ballot in most of the South. He was elected president of a nation where nearly half the states considered him their enemy. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. Before Lincoln even took office, 6 more states followed. By the time Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, the Confederate States of America had already formed, with Jefferson Davis as its president. Lincoln's first inaugural address was a masterpiece of careful language. He assured the South he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he was equally clear: the Union was perpetual, secession was illegal, and he would fulfill his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. 5 weeks later, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln faced challenges no president had ever confronted. He had to maintain the loyalty of the border states, slave states that had not seceded. He had to build an army virtually from scratch. He had to find generals capable of winning battles. He had to manage a cabinet filled with men who thought they should be president instead of him. And he had to do all of this while half the country was trying to destroy the Union he was sworn to preserve. The early years of the war were disastrous for the Union. Confederate forces won victory after victory. Lincoln cycled through generals, searching for someone who would fight aggressively. He taught himself military strategy, reading books late into the night, visiting battlefields, consulting with officers. But Lincoln was also grappling with the deeper question of the war's purpose. Initially, he defined the conflict as purely about preserving the Union, not about ending slavery. This was strategic. He needed to keep the border states loyal and maintain Northern unity. Many Northern whites were willing to fight to save the Union but not to free enslaved people. Yet Lincoln knew the war's moral dimension could not be ignored indefinitely. Enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines by the thousands. The Confederacy was using slave labor to support its war effort. And increasingly, abolitionists and radical Republicans were demanding that the war become explicitly about ending slavery. On January 1, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It was a war measure, legally justifiable under the president's military powers. It did not free enslaved people in the border states or in areas already under Union control, but it fundamentally transformed the war's meaning. From that moment forward, every Union advance became an advance for freedom. The war was no longer just about restoring the old Union. It was about creating a new birth of freedom. As Lincoln would later phrase it at Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 was the war's turning point. Over 3 days, Union forces under General George Meade defeated Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. More than 50,000 casualties. The Confederate high tide had been reached and would never come again. 4 months later, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. Edward Everett, the most famous orator of the age, spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. Everett's speech was forgotten within days. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address became immortal. For 47 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In 10 sentences and 272 words, Lincoln redefined the war, the nation, and America's founding principles. The war was not merely about preserving the Union as it had been, but about ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In 1864, Lincoln faced re-election during the darkest period of the war. Casualties were mounting. The war seemed endless. Many in his own party wanted to replace him with a more radical candidate. Democrats nominated George McClellan, the general Lincoln had fired, running on a peace platform. Then, in September, General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta. The military situation shifted dramatically. Lincoln won re-election with 55% of the popular vote, carrying every Union state except Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. In early 1865, Union armies were closing in on the Confederacy from all directions. Sherman had marched through Georgia and the Carolinas. Grant was besieging Lee's forces around Petersburg and Richmond. The end was near. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War was effectively over. More than 600,000 Americans had died, more than all other American wars combined until World War II. The nation was exhausted, traumatized, and now faced the monumental task of reconstruction. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before Lee's surrender, laid out his vision for peace, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He wanted reconciliation, not revenge. He wanted to bind up the nation's wounds and move forward together. On the evening of April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham and Mary Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the third act, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and famous actor, entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where doctors worked through the night, but the wound was mortal. At 7:22 the next morning, April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The man who had been born in a dirt floor cabin, who had educated himself by firelight, who had lost his mother, his first love, and 2 of his children, who had guided the nation through its darkest crisis, was gone. He was 56 years old, but Abraham Lincoln's legacy was just beginning. The 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States, was ratified in December 1865. Lincoln had fought for its passage before his death, seeing it as essential to ensuring the war's meaning would be permanent. Lincoln transformed the presidency, demonstrating that the office could be a force for moral leadership, not just political management. He transformed the Constitution, showing that it was a living document capable of adaptation to meet new challenges. And he transformed America itself, turning a nation that tolerated slavery into one founded, at least in principle, on universal human equality. He was not perfect. His views on race evolved over time, and even at their most progressive, they retained elements that we would find troubling today. He suspended habeas corpus during the war. He made military and political decisions that can be legitimately questioned. But Lincoln's greatness lies not in perfection, but in growth. He was willing to change his mind when presented with evidence. He was willing to admit mistakes. He possessed a rare combination of moral conviction and political pragmatism. He knew when to stand firm and when to compromise. He understood that democracy is messy, that progress is incremental, and that perfect solutions are rarely available. Most remarkably, Lincoln never lost his compassion. Despite the pressures of war, despite personal tragedy, despite the hatred directed at him from both North and South, he maintained his basic humanity. He pardoned soldiers sentenced to death for desertion. He visited hospitals to comfort the wounded. He wrote condolence letters to mothers who had lost sons in battle. Abraham Lincoln proved that leadership is not about where you start, but about who you become. The boy from the log cabin became the man who saved the Union and freed 4 million people from bondage. His life stands as evidence that in America, at its best, birth does not determine destiny. Character, courage, and commitment to principles larger than oneself, these are what ultimately matter. Today, Lincoln's memorial stands on the National Mall in Washington, a temple to American ideals. His face is carved into Mount Rushmore. His words are quoted by leaders around the world. But his real legacy lives in the nation he preserved and the freedom he expanded. The story of Abraham Lincoln is America's story, imperfect, struggling, stumbling, yet always striving toward those ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. Lincoln did not complete that journey. We are still on it, but he pointed the way forward. And that may be the greatest legacy any leader can leave. Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss our explorations into the lives and moments that shaped our world, and discover how the past continues to illuminate our present.